We're going to have a little chat about, yeah, it's up there, what our nieces can actually do on the weekend, or what they actually are doing on the weekend. But first, I would like to ask my fellow panelists here for a very brief introduction of who you are. Maybe, I don't know, ladies first?
Hello, I think everybody's heard enough from me already.
Hi, I'm Stewart Love. I'm Head of Digital Services at the IET. I've been working at the IET for 15 years now, and I've been working in digital for, actually I don't want to do the maths, longer than 15 years.
I'm Ove Kahler. I work at Brill. I lead the operations department there where the platforms are being managed. And I can tell you, your niece works at Brill. I'll tell you more about that later.
Oh, then now it's getting interesting, yeah. I didn't even know I had a niece, but yeah. Let's see. So I'll kick off the discussion with three brief anecdotes and then, start with the questions. And these are three things that happened to me in the last year or last couple of years repeatedly. And it's an upcoming topic in many discussions I have with publishers and IT folks in publishing. So the first one, I sometimes do a bit of pro bono consulting for small startups, especially in the Berlin area where I'm based. And so I've been involved with a couple of them who told me, yeah, we're going to build this academics, like doing a startup out of university. We're going to build a peer review system because the existing systems are crap. And so we're going to do it better and nicer and whatever. How hard can it be, right? So actually, I hooked them up with some folks at various publishing houses and just asked them, just take a look at what's happening behind the scenes so you can understand the complexity before you spend the money. And for some of them, that they actually did some kind of pivot then before they started. Some of them tried to do it nevertheless, but with not too much success here. The second one is a bit, a couple of years out. I was still working for a publishing house, and we published many things. Amongst them were interactive dialect maps. So, and that was in 2006, so back then very advanced multimedia stuff. And there was this one researcher and he built these maps using like some kind of Java application he programmed himself. And we were basically told, this is like the best you can get, you can't do it better, you have to publish it as is because my data is embedded in the Java application too, so there's no way around it. And I was told back then, so we're not spending a penny on it, so just use it and put it on the website. And I gave them the usual talk about, well, maintenance and security, and we just publish it, and 2 years down the road, it stopped working because the browsers changed and the code didn't. And we went back to the researcher who had promised that he would look after it, and we said, oh no, I've moved on to different fields, and sorry, not going to update it. So that's the second story. And the third and last anecdote is really just recently, 4 weeks ago, got a call from a CEO from a publishing house. He was quite excited, or in a negative way, because one of his star authors, he absolutely wanted to have an app for his book. It's professional books publishing, and the author insisted on having this app, even though there was no real reason for it. And that's where the quote comes from. And apparently the author said to him, well, my niece can do it on the weekend, how hard can it be, right? So just shut up and do it. And this sort of outlined a little trend I've been seeing. So my first question to you would really be, have you experienced situations like this before? And no, not exactly like this, but similar. And if so, how did you handle them? And especially, how did you communicate with the management or other parties about this?
Well, I had a very similar situation to your last anecdote, when I was told that we could build a website in a weekend. And of course, it is actually true. You can do it. You wouldn't want to maintain it or host it, but you can do it. As you say, the point at which then is understanding what the business outcomes are, because in the answer to that question is the complexity. So you can build a website in a weekend. It's just not connected to anything and is probably horrifically insecure. And as you say, the challenge for us is going from the point of perceived agility, where actually you could do it that quickly, to meeting the business goals. And what language can you use when people don't want to hear what you're trying to tell them? And I'm not always successful at that. Is the answer to that. But pointing out that actually that you need to get these people, your customers, into your CRM. You need to take money. You need to do it securely. GDPR has been a great thing, because when you threaten people with 4%, the conversation tends to go the way that you want it to.
Yeah, so it's a term that we hear quite a lot. I think the alternative is it's just a line of code. It's just a line of code that we get thrown up quite a bit. And I think just to speak to the point about, yes, you could build it over the weekend, and having nieces and nephews who are quite young who probably can build these things, they're at primary school. I would also put forward as like, they could build it, but is that what you would really want? And I think it really is that point of, what are the expected outcomes of doing this? What are the user behaviours that you're trying to influence by building something? And would something that can be thrown together over the weekend actually satisfy those needs? I think there's issues of scalability, security, and everything else that goes in there. But I think it's not just meeting that small finite goal, but what is the overall vision that you're trying to deliver, and building something over the weekend, whilst it's absolutely possible, is not always the right thing to do. And that's really the message that we try and go back to some of the leadership team about as well.
Okay, so now about the niece. It's not your niece, it's the niece of the CEO, or of this author of the CEO. Well, I don't know whether it's the same person, but we have someone in our company, so we are actually going through a phase of change, and a very interesting, partly disruptive phase of change, by having acquired a database. We are a humanities publisher, traditionally strong in books, still printed books, but also journals. And what makes us really special in databases, language-specific databases, really a little bit nerd databases for very niche audiences in the humanities. And one of those databases was acquired a few years ago, and with it, the founder, and this is the niece, it's the nephew actually, and he can build things in an afternoon. So we have this one book, a normal monograph that needs to be integrated in our ebook collections, in our production system, but it has 3,000 sound fragments that need to be presented in a certain way. How to read verses of the Quran. So we tried to get it into Figshare, we contacted people at Digital Science, and in the meantime he said, it's already online, I put it there. I have my own environment. This is something that is fascinating on the one hand, but it's also a bit frightening on the other hand. Is it sustainable? We are in business already 330 years. Is this book with these sound fragments still available in 330 years? Well, maybe we shouldn't think that far, but how sustainable is that? And I should say, we will talk a bit more, this experience of having this guy in the company has really changed our way of thinking about this. Our challenge is to combine this new way of doing things with, well, should I call it the old way, but the more mature way of doing things, and how to find a balance in that. And that's what we are busy with right now.
That's a very interesting point, yeah. To come back to some of your answers, I really like the GDPR 4% argument, because that's really also, to my experience, a very effective way of resolving discussions. And it shows, right? I mean, before you can talk for hours about security, about sustainability, etc. Nobody really listens. But the moment you threaten with something that really hurts 4% of the bottom line, then it's a different story. It's a bit sad, but But is this something that like how do you actually approach this? Because I thought sometimes it feels like we're being framed into bringing up all these boring negative things like maintenance, security, stability, performance, which are not really, I mean, they're not sexy, right? But we have to bring them up and we have to take care of them. And at the same time, it's really hard to communicate them in a positive way without resorting to the 4% threat. Have you found any effective strategy of doing that besides like just trying and trying and trying?
I think it's fair to say that catastrophizing does sometimes end up being the default position, and I'm very conscious of catastrophizing because then it becomes less meaningful as well, and I think that is something that we do need to, be mindful of. One of the advantages that I think we have at Emerald is that we do have, unfortunately, a rich history of taking existing systems, and whether they be vendor licensed or open source, and trying to bend them into things that they're not designed to do. And that for me really is one of the main drawbacks of building something over the weekend, is that what that piece of code or that code set was really intended to do, and is it actually going to work for your intended outcomes? We have had some entwined legacy systems that we've needed to or not as a result of doing that, and I guess once you've been burnt by that, it's a lot easier to get your point across.
I think you need to think about this in two ways, and the way is obviously that when your developers are coding, that it shouldn't even be a question. So, it should be secure by design. Now, obviously, that's easier said than done in some cases, but that shouldn't be a conversation for the organization. The conversation really becomes important when you look about lifecycle management of applications, particularly ones you bent the hell out of. Because then the conversation is, well, we know that it is insecure and it's going to get increasingly insecure as a function of time. But it's a key system. So how do you, and that's where it really becomes a key and a difficult conversation for the organization. And one where they don't always understand the conversation that you're having, because of course when you start talking security, you sound a bit like Charlie Brown's teacher, where just wah, 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 wah. So how do you carry that weight? And the weight again goes back to the business value, that at some point the end case of this, and without catastrophizing, is we will have to switch this off, or it will stop working. And you relay that back to the business aims that the system is trying to deliver. But when you're coding, it shouldn't even be a discussion, I would argue.
Yeah, you ask about the conversation with management. Well, that's obviously a different conversation with the people, unless in your case where the CEO came to you. But often it's a different conversation with the people who come to us and want things, and they refer to their niece or to their nephew. And then I think what always helps is the question, what problem are we trying to solve? To really go back to the basic. What is actually the core of what we are doing, and what are our business objectives? And if we have a very long list of projects, of wishes, very innovative, very boring wishes, but they all can be boiled down to three. Increase revenue, decrease cost, or manage risk. We are a publicly listed company, and as soon as you map out wishes, as innovative as they are, as much as they are related to a new value proposition, we are an innovative publisher. As soon as you hit too much on the third corner of that triangle, the risk part, if you include that in the mapping of whatever you want to do, then you have a better conversation, and you are not just against something, but you are for something. You are for these three objectives of the company that need to be managed properly. I won't say that we have been always successful in leading that conversation constructively, but that's at least a sort of a talking point.
And you're obviously your companies are very different from each other, like membership organization, publicly listed company, humanities, STM, engineering, so very different from each other. But Do you have like any formal processes or structures how to approach decision making in matters like, are we going to do it ourselves, or are we going to sign up with some vendor off the shelf versus DIY, closed versus open source, stuff like this? I think you already mentioned you probably have some kind of security audit that code has to go through. That's probably not always the case. So I think it would be interesting to learn like how you approach these decisions, whether it's more, it's a formal procedure like ITIL following their guidelines, or whether it's more ad hoc, dependent on the situation.
Now, maybe I can start. I think we are, for the things that we do in-house now, also thanks to this new phase, well, we are not following a script or a full guide, but that's also the whole point. It is a little bit happening in what I would maybe call the lab part of our organization, and maybe that's where it should be. I understand that what Emerald is doing, putting all their things on a new platform, on a self-built platform, is something different than a lab. There are other measures need to be in place, and we have other measures in place for our main platform. That's why that platform is also run by an external vendor who has more expertise than we have in-house. We have not taken the step to do this in-house. But for a new small database or a new resource that is very related to a very particular community, the risk is also smaller, and therefore also the freedom to experiment with things and do things new. I compare it a bit maybe with, if we are a restaurant, we have two kitchens. We have the kitchen for the huge guest groups that come with buses, so we better use a catering service for those.
So where the money is?
Sorry?
Where the money is, basically?
Where the money is, yes. But then we also have our little boutique kitchen, and then it would not make sense to order a caterer for that. Then we have our own people who experiment, and then also sometimes things go wrong, and there's sometimes smoke coming out of the kitchen. But if we keep this, and if we actually make these two kitchens part of the same restaurant, I think then we can only benefit from each other. This is a bit the phase where we are in, which I also referred to earlier.
Running wild with the metaphors here.
I mean, I think the distinction I would draw is between the things that we do that are stable and the things that where we're more at the cutting edge. So we're not a software house. You know, we build software, but we're not a software house. So if we can get it off the shelf, commercial off the shelf, and we don't have to bend the hell out of it, why would we build it? And you know, why would we host it? Why would we have the opportunity cost of looking after the servers and keeping all of that horrible, boring stuff that developers don't like to do? So for those things, you would absolutely just go to where you can get it, and if you can, and it's reasonable, pay them to do it. Where it's complicated, we're a big fan of emergent architectures. So we'll use open source if open source is the answer to that question. The first thing is getting a stable answer to the question, and then the second part is making sure that it's an architecture that can be supported and is cost effective going forward. And if that's open source, if it's not open source, we don't have any particular, we're not evangelists for open source, but neither are we scared of using it where it's appropriate. So I think that's the distinction that I would look. We don't want to be software developers, and we don't want to be commercial software developers, sorry, in that sense, I think is where we are.
So our experience is not massively different, to be honest. When we talk about taking back the control of our platform back in house at Emerald, the main emphasis of that has really been around the architecture, and that's where the investment has been in terms of strengthening our capability within architecture. We employ very much a modular architecture to how the platform is built, and so very much in a similar steps, you know, how you've both described, is that when we're looking at the piece of software, the piece of code that we perhaps need to employ to deliver some outcomes, we look at what is it that we're trying to do. Are there any cost constraints? Are there any other elements such as security, stability that we would want to consider? And who and how are we best placed to deliver that? In some circumstances, it may be that it's something where we would want an element of flexibility, creativity, you know, where it's a value that we are that we're genuinely adding, and we might develop that ourselves. But in terms of pieces of architecture that are standardized or very complex, then we would certainly look to who is the best person to supply that for us, whether it be through a licensed vendor or open source. Going back to your original question around do we have a structure for actually validating and assessing that, it's very much evolving. We don't have a standard script, but we take really a product management framework to evaluate, and we look at the value, the viability, the feasibility, the usability, and we apply that within our architectural group to determine how best to deliver something.
Thank you. And by the way, if you have any questions, please just raise your hand and we'll pass the mic out to you as well. Yes.
So I've got two comments, but I'll just start by expanding on what you said. It was a discussion we had with one of the companies we work with, a Sage company called Talus. And when they go to build something or make a decision to build, one of the things they do with their engineering teams is tell them to take a week or 2 weeks to go away and do a prototype solution in at least 2 different technologies. So often they'll have a conversation with their engineers or with someone who finds a really interesting piece of technology who's like, I want the flashy new. And they'll go, okay, try it that way, but also at the same time, try it with the boring stack. And then let's come back and review what we've learned in that short period of time. And more often than not, they go with the boring approach or they don't do it, but they do it from a position of having learnt more. And I think that's a really interesting approach. And so it might sound like you're wasting a bit of time up front, but actually you're making a much better decision in the long run. And I'd just like to add my own perspective on this topic, because I am totally fascinated by this question of my niece can build this, or it's just one line of code. And my perspective on this is what's going on here is software is intrinsically invisible. And to people who don't work with it from the outside, the difference between that which is trivially possible and that which is completely impossible, there is no way to tell. So can I change this color on this font? Could be trivially easy, but it may also be something where there's some legacy systems that you don't want to touch. Like the great example I heard from this is if you give someone an image of a bird in flight in the sky and you tell somebody, I've got a machine learning algorithm that can tell you which bird that is, they'll be like, oh, that's amazing. Can you also tell me which national park that photo was taken in? And you're like, no. And you're like, well, wait a minute. You can tell me which bird it is, but you can't tell me when and where it was taken? These things are, there's no sense or reason between what's possible and what isn't. And the things that are possible and are impossible change over time. And that's where there's real interesting windows of opportunity, understanding when something has gone from being impossible to being merely annoying to being run-of-the-mill. And so it's just a fascinating topic of conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, good point. And I think that's something that we as IT people need to be aware of, that we learn how to communicate about these invisible barriers or non-barriers. I think that is an important success factor.
Just to add to that, I think also we become victims of our own success to an extent as well, because the fact that it looks so simplistic is the fact that we've streamlined the user experience of it, which is exactly what we want to do. We want a really intuitive interface for our users. The downside of it is it looks like you could build it in an hour, which is usually far from the case.
So we should really go back to Windows 3.1.
Yes,
I think
make it look really complex.
Oh, yeah.
So in just listening to this and listening to some of the other talks, it strikes me that actually I think we have quite a large issue within the industry, and it may be more generalizable, in that people don't actually understand what risk is. And that's the thing that the more and more discussions that I've experienced, not just necessarily where I work, but talking with others, I'm always struck. One of the points about my talk this morning was a complete failure by a bunch of very, very motivated, highly idealistic people desperately trying to change the way our bit of the world works, and there's a complete failure on their side to think that there might just possibly be some bad actors. And if they can't conceive of a world where there might be some bad actors, And I've had those conversations. Why should I have to sign in and tell you who I am so I can use your API? Well, it's because I want to make sure you're not a hacker, right? Because I want to control the input and the output from the server that I'm paying for. It's a ridiculously simple thing that anybody should be, but they don't understand that, and yet they're actually working with that technology. And I think we see a lot of that. I don't know about anybody else, whether you've had the experience where you sit down and you have the sacred risk meeting for the project. That one, it's brilliant, isn't it? That's not 2 hours of your life you're never getting back. Right, there you are, you're laughing, so everybody's had the same meeting, right? But you think there and think, right, we need a load of risks because we're not getting the money for this project unless we've told people that we thought about some risks and we've written it down and those are our risks. Well, those aren't the risks, are they? They're just the things that you thought of, right? And I think that's a systematic problem we have in our industry, that we seem to have an inability, regardless of the technology, to think of the upsides and the downsides and the scenarios of whatever it is that we're trying to do. Right, I'll shut up now and stop ranting. Apologies.
Just thinking about the terminology of software as a service. So basically, there is no software as a service. There's only a software with a service. It's about complexity. It's about the fact that we're dealing with much higher extent of complex software, and Denise will think about something really easy to use on her mobile, which is very mature and very off the shelf and very used by millions in a very low degree of complexity, and that's the difference.
So relating to the risk, but also to Sarah's point earlier about the seemingly overwhelming desire in publishing houses to bend systems to your processes instead of actually taking a look at those processes and working out if they are still fit for purpose. Does any of the panel have any suggestions about how to get past that as one of the big risks of any project, which is, well, yes, it's 90% of what we want, but what about this 10% over here? And that seems to be the thing that trips up most of the projects that I've been involved with.
Well, it's something I certainly recognise, and my experience is this is about where the decisions get made. So, I mean, you know, we all think we're special, we all think our processes are special when they all basically do the same thing. And you can get an agreement at the senior level that we're going to buy a system and we're not going to bend it. The problem is, at that point, I've always found that the decision-making gets devolved from the senior level down into the people who actually do the job. And I think there are two things. One, A, they can't conceive the job any other way than the way that they've always done it. And B, it's about incentivization. So, you know, we've just done a project where we've had exactly this problem. And the incentivization, the things they get measured on is a point halfway through the process. So, you know, something happens and they have to write it on goat vellum and then put it back into the system. And they get measured on how many goats they kill and how much goat vellum gets produced. And so you can guarantee that the system we develop will have a goat killing and vellum producing step in the middle of it. And that's and it's that distinction between the executives who agree, of course we will simplify our processes, and their attention to the decisions that then get made in the project is, I found often where the delta between intent and end system always lies.
I was just going to say as well, so as a programmer, I'm going to play slightly a position of devil's advocate, that I think also, particularly with regard to complexity, you have to distinguish between intrinsic complexity or complexity that's actually an inherent feature of the domain versus accidental complexity that's arising because people aren't writing enough tests, there's weird stuff going on in your business workflow, you're only doing releases into production every 3 months. And I think it's, to the point earlier around kind of what is becoming possible. So there are companies now that are doing continuous delivery and they are getting production quality code out in, may not be a day or two, but at very short periods of time. So, yeah, I guess it's not for me maybe not such a straightforward distinction. And actually, I think often it's a useful exercise to say, well, actually, for us to be able to get code out in 2 days, what would we have to change? Why is the security review only every 2 weeks? Could we get the security person pairing with the developer, then we wouldn't need the security review, and actually we could get it out the door in 2 days.
I think regarding complexity, we talked about the communication, that is, where the conversation started. A big challenge in the communication is also when there is denial of complexity. What we want is just so simple. It's just a books and journals platform. It must be white label. Why can it be so difficult? And then you mention you want this, you want that. You urge them to make the requirements, to spell them out. And they are on paper, you see. It's a long, long list of dozens of pages. And they say, but that's all standard. That must all be there. So many publishers have it already. Why can it be expensive? Why can it take long to configure it to our needs? Well, because there's always a certain tweaking needed for our needs, that our business model just works a little bit different from the ones of the competitors. But that is this denial that is in the detail also. What is also, I think, a challenge in that communication, I think I wanted to say that before, is that you ease very quickly in the defense. Of course, you took the attack with GDPR. That's always the best approach. Overcome the defense by taking the attack. But yeah, it's not always possible. And yeah, what you said is good. Just say, yes, we can. And then here are the terms and conditions. So we haven't really figured that out. But that's, and that's a part of that, the denial of complexity, that you look into someone's eyes and they say, what are you talking about? Just do it.
But I think Tasha had a very good point that one potential counter-argument might also be, well, why don't we change these 10% of our process to actually match the standard commodity off-the-shelf system that we have just selected? So, yeah. Has anybody ever succeeded in doing this? Good.
We've tried to do that on a number of occasions, and I think the approach that we've kind of settled on is maybe taking a kind of a user experience approach to it, so actually looking at the process itself and sitting with the individuals doing that process and mapping that journey out and doing some kind of mapping of, how happy are they at different parts of that, how difficult is that process, and then you can kind of layer things on like cost of delay at certain parts of the journey. And I think that then can translate into the actual value of and the cost of that process that you're taking. So you can then look at, okay, well, if you're using a standard process, where would that differ? What would the intersection look like? And that can be quite useful to kind of, make the case for changing certain parts of that. And certainly visualizing that, I think, has been helpful in certain organizations.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that also for me touches back to Tasha's point as well about how we can move forward from continuously bending existing systems and code bases out of shape. I think quite often there is the need to connect that user experience and the user mapping into the development team as well, so that, quite often, in my experience anyway, the development teams are not bending systems out of shape for the sake of it. They believe that they are delivering what is required and that the system that already exists can do what it is that we're trying to achieve. But by bringing the user voice closer into the development team and actually bringing that feedback in and helping the teams truly understand what the expected outcome will be and what the impact of either delivering that or not delivering that in the intended way would be, I think does help move us forward from perhaps releasing systems that aren't quite what we expected them to be.
And maybe switch to a slightly related topic. We've heard a lot about open whatever, science, data, source, standards, formats, and it's good as long as it's open. And I think one of the trends or one of the things I'm hearing and I'm seeing is also that the argument, well, there's an open source component out there, why don't you just use it? It's free, it's cheap, and you can just install it and that's it, right? Problem solved. We all know that's not exactly true, at least not all of the time. And then there's also the argument, I think, and especially for smaller publishers, that sometimes if you band together, if you form some sort of cooperation, collaboration, you can actually create an open source version of System X, which will be cheaper than buying it from some vendor or going some whatever other route. And that's certainly a very attractive proposition. But so far, I personally haven't really seen any success stories here. Especially since to make open source work, you really need like some kind of snowball network effect really to make it successful. And from your perspective, is this something that you're also looking at, like looking at certain areas of your IT, of your business, where you think, well, if we can band together with others, we can maybe build like a common infrastructure here and share the load? Is that something that is of interest to you, or are you more like, well, it will be so difficult to get a cooperation going with competitors that we'd rather not do this?
It's not something that we're actively pursuing at the moment. It's certainly something that I think we would be interested in pursuing. We certainly wouldn't have any objection to it. I think, for us, it does relate to some of the points that Phil was making in the session earlier, is that as part of the core modular architecture, there are certain elements that are standard. They're complex, but they are standard, and they don't necessarily add value to the overall workflow, to the point that you made. They're things that we're all doing. And so I think in terms of the parts of our business delivery that don't add value are just things that need to be done, such as authentication, tracking, reporting, counter, anything like that, then absolutely, I think we would be happy to work as some kind of consortia to do that. Emerald operates very much within the social sciences field, so we already have good relationships with a number of other publishers that are our peers and not direct competitors, and that's certainly something going forward that I think we would be really happy to pursue relationships. And that's not to say that we wouldn't be happy to do that with direct competitors as well. I think it's just that we're quite early in our journey as more of a software developer, that we haven't had the opportunity to pursue that yet.
So interestingly for us, it's been a question that we've looked at in the last couple of years at the IET in our role as an engineering institution as opposed to a publisher. There was a report that came out, the UF report, that said that we should all work more closely together, and we explored it. We're not doing it, so you can draw your own conclusions from that. I think it ties us back to the question that we just answered, and that is that we all believe that we are special, no matter what it is that we're doing. So the ability to work together on a platform meaningfully is difficult, because obviously you need to start off from the point that everybody's happy as a place to start. How do you develop it? What do you do? Do you come to the common standards? Do you come to the common way of working? Okay. Do you then stay to common ways of working going forward? Are you prepared to be tied to that? Are you prepared to potentially fund somebody else's development because they're going to go off? Are you going to branch your code? Are you going to white label it? Or what are you going to do? And so it sounds like a very easy thing to say, well, we should, it's the same platform, we're doing the same things. But fundamentally, we're not. And so in terms of the open, all of the opens that you were talking about earlier, till we get to open standards and similar workflows, then actually, all you're doing is taking what would be a complex development for yourself and adding complexity which you then don't own. And the other people all have to be prepared to buy into that as well. So it sounds like a thing. It could be great if we could find a way to do it. I'm sure that we'd be more than happy to do it. I have little faith, certainly at the moment, that actually that we'll find something like that where we can work that will have legs. Yeah, I think that's where we found with that one. Yeah.
Well, when I got this question, so we have this discussion as well, and at Brill, and there is this openness to collaboration. How does that sound? Great. But effectively, my response is, are we not already doing this? I'm a bit cynical here, but we work with a platform vendor who bundles the wishes of about 5, 6, 8, 10 other publishers, and they change the platform according to our needs, and we benefit from the changes that are submitted and sometimes paid for by the other clients. It's not an entirely sort of open consortium, I wouldn't go that far, but are we not, by working with a vendor, already sharing the burden? It's not open source, so that is what I hear right away, and so I was talking now about this restaurant part where the catering is happening, where we are not cooking ourselves. We do have this little boutique kitchen where our colleague has recently built a platform, and that is actually really a success in terms of a collaboration, not with another publisher, but with the academic community involved. So I wanted to mention this as an example that it can be successful. We, as Brill in the Humanities, we publish text editions, fragments of Greek, Roman texts, and our customers buy them. They want to have access, they want to have a commented version of that, and that requires a certain viewer of this type of text. Well, these things exist in open source. It's the Persian library, and the company that sort of submitted that to the open source community became our partner in building our own platform, where we now have the code in-house and where we give what we did also back to that community. The problem starts when the people who see this and are fascinated, and it took only 9 months for one person to build a platform, fantastic, then look at this huge hall with, where we cook for 500 people and say, can we not do it there ourselves? And we have, as a result of this is the friction, so disruption is always a positive word. It has a negative component. We have a vendor fatigue to some extent in our company, where we see these experiments going right, great, but can we not also apply it to the big things? Well, we could. Emerald does it, others do it, but it takes an entirely different effort to do that. And that's a bit the sort of the tension here.
Do you have any structure or process in place to make sure you're actively engaging and maintaining that engagement with the academic communities that are collaborating with you on these digital humanities efforts?
We are invited to conferences, the people involved. They give talks, we invite them back. So this is really an industry involvement and a community, an academic community involvement, I should say. It's not a competitor, it's not another publisher, but it's so genuine also to that community that it's the perfect approach. It would not make sense to ask a vendor to build that for us. And so in that sense, it's a very interesting and very promising approach. We have more such communities where very specialized tools are being used and where people are open to sharing things. I should say the product that we now offer on this open source build platform is paid for by customers. So that is where my question came from earlier. We try to strike open deals, big open deals where all countries can access this. That's our ambition. We are very open to open access. We want to encourage that. But we in the end are a commercial company. But that's part of that kitchen to try things out and see how they develop.
Okay, I think we're nearly out of time. Do you any last words, any closing statements? Final advice?
No.
Oh, good. Stay away from IT. No. Okay, then thank you very much for being on this panel and sharing your experiences. Thank you for listening.